Hi everyone, welcome to the Meeting Place Online. Happy New Year! We've actually moved online for this Sunday because in the light of the rising COVID numbers, we wanted to do our part to keep our community, our volunteers, and our staff safe. So we've got a great morning ahead of you. We've got some music from over the past year that we had recorded. We've got a new message coming up from Pastor Paul that ties into last week's message from Brian. And so yeah, Happy New Year. As a special interview, we've got Baby New Year here. Baby New Year, number 2022. What do we have to expect from the next year? All right, keep your secrets about the year. What do you think? You grabbed my mic. What's that timer? Oh. Okay, nap time for a baby.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay, good job.
Before we begin, I want to let you know about an exciting new initiative that we've started up. We want to follow Jesus through acts of compassion. We want to be the hands and feet of Jesus to our community and to those around us, responding to their needs. And there are very many needs this year. And so we have started a care fund, and this is something that you can contribute to. So this is a giving opportunity where 100% of your donations will be going to a fund to respond when people need food, when they need clothes, bills paid, counseling. We want to have the capacity to be able to respond to people in their need. So if you want to know more about it, it's on our website right now, themeetingplace.mb.ca/carefund. There are some responses to possible questions you might have, as well as the ways that you can contribute to this. Your donations are receivable, and again, 100% of your donations to this fund goes towards the people in need. As well, if you'd like to support The Meeting Place, you can check us out on our website at themeetingplace.mb.ca/give. There you can find out different ways that you can financially support us. It helps us keep the lights on, it helps pay our salaries, as well as it helps us with the various programming and initiatives that we have going on. Now, before we get into the morning's teaching, let's worship together.
All right, whenever you're ready. Come out of sadness from wherever you've been. Come broken-hearted, let rescue begin. Come find your mercy, oh sinner, come kneel. Earth has no sorrow that heaven can heal. Earth has no sorrow that heaven can heal. So lay down your burdens, lay down your shame. All who are broken, lift up your faith. Oh, wanderer, come. Oh, you're not too far. So lay down your hurt, lay down your heart, come as you are. There's hope for the hopeless and all those who stray. Come sit at the table, come taste the grace. There's rest for the weary, rest that endures. Earth has no sorrow that heaven can cure. So lay down your burden, lay down your shame. All who are broken, lift up your faith. Oh, wanderer, come home. too far. So lay down your hurt, lay down your heart, come as you are, come as you are, fall in His arms, come as you are. There's joy for the morning, oh sinner, be still. Earth has no sorrow that heaven can heal. Earth has no sorrow that heaven can heal. So lay down your burdens, lay down your shame. All who are broken, lift up your faith. Oh, wanderer, come home. You're not too far. So lay down your hurt, lay down your heart, come as you are.
Sometimes on this journey, I get lost in my mistakes. What looks to me like weakness is a canvas for your strength. My story isn't over, my story's just begun. And failure wants to find me, 'cause that's what my Father does. Oh, failure wants to find me, 'cause that's what my Father does. Ooh. Your shame out the door, 'cause it ain't welcome anymore. Ooh, you're in the Father's house. Arrival's not the end game, the journey is where you are. Never wanted perfect, you just wanted my heart. And the story isn't over if the story isn't good. Failure's never final when the Father's in the room. Oh, failure's never final when the Father's in the room. Ooh, lay your burdens down. Ooh, here in the Father's house. Check your shame at the door, 'cause it ain't welcome anymore. Ooh, you're in the Father's house. The prodigals come home, the helpless find hope. Love is on the move when the Father's in the room. Prison doors fling wide, the dead come to life. Love is on the move when the Father's in the room. Hey! Miracles take place, can. Love is breaking through when the Father's in the room. Love is breaking through when the Father's in the room. Ooh, lay your burdens down. Ooh, you're in the Father's house. Check your shame at the door, 'cause it ain't welcome anymore. Ooh, you're in the Father's house. Yeah.
Welcome to church, everybody. Well, church online. I know we're not in person, but I know we sure hope to be soon. I want to thank all of you who have adjusted to the switch and are joining us on the live stream. If you're new here, I'm Paul Walker. I'm the teaching pastor here at the meeting place. And I want to just thank you for joining us today. It's awesome to have you here. Well, let's start with last week. Last week, December 26th, Pastor Brian taught on the gift of pause. If you haven't seen it, I encourage you to check it out because Brian walked us through this ancient practice of the examine, taking time to pause and reflect on the year that's gone by. It was so good. I really recommend it to you. Well, this week, we're going to follow a similar format to what we did last week. Consider this part 2 of what Pastor Brian shared. Only instead of pausing to examine the past, we're actually going to take some time to ask more future-focused questions as we look ahead to 2022. Speaking of which, Happy New Year, everybody. It's January 2nd, 2022. Like, can you believe that? Here we are in 2022. So you just know that a friend, a coworker, or a family member is going to come up to you at some point in the next couple days and raise the question to ask in the immediate days following the change of a calendar year. And I'm guessing you know the question, right? It goes like this. So, did you make any New Year's resolutions this year? By which they mean, what goals for the year have you set? What plans do you have? What have you resolved to do in the next 365 days around the sun? And I think this leads us to our first reflection question. Do you make New Year's resolutions? Do you set goals? Why or why not? So full confession, I'm not the hugest fan of New Year's resolutions. They are these sentimental things that folks like to talk about, but I really wonder, do they even make a difference? Because the stats on New Year's resolutions are not promising. For starters, only 40% of people actually even make a New Year's resolution. And out of those 40%, 80% of New Year's resolutions are broken by the first week of February. The best statistics tell us that only 8% of New Year's resolutions are ever completed. And I bet you those are just the easy ones. Like, tomorrow I'm going to brush my teeth. Or tomorrow I will not sleep in. So it seems to me that the whole practice of New Year's resolutions has largely been reduced to this trivial social contract of naming the vapid platitudes that will surely break by February. And to that I say, bah humbug. Yeah, you can even call me the Scrooge of New Year's resolutions. But on the other hand, I don't think anarchy, nihilism, or a lawless world of like no goals is a valid option either. I mean, I tried that in college and it didn't work. It just gave me mediocre grades and a headache. So every New Year's, I do find that I'm thinking about the year that's passed. And I'm also thinking about the year that's ahead of me. And I think taking time to ask such questions can be a meaningful practice. But it's more than that. Because I'm convinced that for those that follow Jesus, who have the rhythms of our lives immersed in the scriptures, we actually discover that taking time to reflect, to evaluate, to plan, and even to like set meaningful goals is the heart of wisdom. You should know that the Bible has a lot to say about wisdom. It's the way of understanding. It's when experience and knowledge meet the reverence for God. Proverbs 8:11 says that wisdom is more precious than rubies. In fact, there are entire books of the Bible like Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job that are called the wisdom books. And it's not just limited to the wisdom books either. Throughout the rest of Scripture, we find that the theme of wisdom shows up time and time again. Like, for example, there's a whole list of the wisdom psalms, psalms that have the teaching of wisdom in them. One of the wisdom psalms I find myself reflecting on at New Year's is Psalm 90. It's said to be a prayer of Moses. And the psalm starts with praising the transcendence of God throughout time. I want you to listen to these words. Lord, you have been our dwelling place throughout all generations. Before the mountains were born, or you brought forth the whole world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. You turn people back to dust, saying, return to dust, you mortals. 1,000 years in your sight are like a day that has just gone by, or like a watch in the night. Psalm 90, verses 1-4. I love how Moses here thinks and writes about the timelessness of God as he opens the psalm. From everlasting to everlasting. Like, that's a powerful line. I love that line. You might even write it like, from infinity to infinity. I mean, before the mountains were born. But not so us. Like, verse 3 here, we are the dust. We may have the experience of tiredness of another year gone by. The last year, 2 years, in fact, may have dragged on for us. But to God, 1,000 years is kind of like a day. I mean, this is a metaphor. We shouldn't take it too literally, but I mean, you get what it's getting at. And I find that a very helpful perspective as we enter into the new year. Though I may have a lot of anxiousness looking towards 2022, though I may be tempted to worry about this upcoming year, though I may even be frustrated and just feeling a lot of exhaustion from the last year, though I may not even be ready for another year of changes, I think the good news that this psalm opens with is that God is a constant in all of this, a rock and a firm foundation from everlasting to everlasting. God is the I am that I am. And it means that no matter what the year ahead of us brings, God is with us, our dwelling place throughout all generations. Nothing can shake that. Nothing can change that. And as the Apostle Paul will later remind us, nothing can ever separate us from the love of God. And so I think this brings us to our next reflection question. As you enter 2022, How can you make space for the truth that God is with us in every generation? Back to Psalm 90. After spending some space talking about like the transcendence of God, Moses shifts here in this psalm to like the minor key. He begins to talk about like the frailty of the human condition. Like in verse 8, Moses talks about this reality of sin. In verse 10, Moses talks about the struggle of human life and how short it is. The length of our days is 70 years or 80 if we have strength, he writes. But then in verse 12, Moses introduces the major key of wisdom. And in the context of human frailty, in the context of like, hey, we are just dust, he writes, Lord, teach us to number our days that we may gain a heart of wisdom. Verse 12. And this is really more than being good at math. It's more than just like, hey, being really good at counting. It's more than like, for example, saying that as of today, January 2nd, I've worked at TMP for 1,462 days. But that's besides the point. What Moses is getting at is that we should not take for granted each day that we have. To number our days is not to treat the time we have like an unending commodity. From dust we came, to dust we shall return. We are vapor, here today, gone tomorrow. And I think knowing this limitation produces humility. And hopefully that humility will produce in us a kind of patience. And that patience gives space for reflection. And when we reflect, when we consider, I think that helps us gain the heart of wisdom. So, verse 12, teach us to number our days that we may gain a heart of wisdom. I think this can be a gift for us in the new year if we'll receive it. Every New Year's Eve can be a reminder that we've gone one more time around the sun and that there'll be a day when you and I don't complete this journey. I want to help us capture this idea that Moses writes to us of the numbering our days. And I have a video illustration. It's called The Time We Have Left. And it's by Zay Frank. Check this video out.
These are roughly 28,835 jelly beans. I counted out 500 of them and used those to weigh the rest. In this pile, there's one jelly bean for each day that the average American will live. You might have more beans in your life, or maybe less, but on average, this is the time we have. Here's a single bean. It's your very first day. A special day, but kind of a rough day on everyone involved. Add 364 more and you have the first year of your life. Now, for a sense of scale, here are your first 15 years, 5,475 days, which brings us to the threshold of adulthood. And at that moment, this is the time that we have left. And this is, on average, what we will do with all that time. We will be asleep for a total of 8,477 days. If we're lucky, some of that time we'll be sleeping next to someone we love. We will be in the process of eating, drinking, or preparing food for 1,635 days. We'll be at work, hopefully doing something satisfying, for the equivalent of 3,202 of those days. 1,099 days will be spent commuting or traveling from one place to another, maybe a little bit more if you live in LA. On average, we will watch television in one form or another for a total of 2,676 days. Household activities like chores and tending to our pets and shopping will take another 1,576 days. And we will care for the needs and well-being of others, our friends and family, for 564 days. We'll spend 671 days bathing, grooming, and doing all other bathroom-related activities, and another 720 days will go to community activities like religious and civic duties, charities, and taking classes. After we remove all those beans, this is what remains. This is the time that we have left. Time for laughing, swimming, making art, going on hikes, text messages, reading, checking Facebook, playing softball, maybe even teaching yourself how to play the guitar. So what are you going to do with this time? How much of it do you think you've already used up? If you only had half of it, what would you do differently? What about half of that? How much time have you already spent worrying instead of doing something that you love? What if you just had one more day? What are you going to do today?
Now I share today about the shortness of life for a good reason. I'm not just trying to cause you to worry or to panic or to have an existential crisis. I share today about numbering our days to help us consider, how are we living our lives? What are we going to do with the time we have left? And are we making the most of each day? I think questions like this are needed and even necessary. If we are to live with any sort of intentionality and wisdom in our lives, I think we can't avoid these kind of questions. I love how the Apostle Paul, writing to the church in Ephesus, he writes this in Ephesians chapter 5. He writes this, he says, "Be careful then how you live, not as unwise people, but as wise, making the most of every opportunity, because the days are evil. Therefore, do not be foolish, but understand what the Lord's will is." Notice how the Apostle Paul connects this concept of wisdom we've been talking about this morning to the concept of time. Make the most of the time you have. I mean, the church in Ephesus, I'm convinced they would have heard these words against the cultural background of their city. Ephesus was one of the most important cities in the Roman Empire, second only to Rome. And they were a city really at the cross sections of Asia Minor. Ephesus was this port city, a major land route and sea route. It was full of hustle and bustle, like a New York of its day. And if you were traveling anywhere in the Greco-Roman world, whether by land or sea, it seems that you eventually ended up in Ephesus. It was like a major airport terminal, so to speak. And so when the Apostle Paul talked about making the most of the time, I'm convinced the Ephesians might have thought about all those travelers in their city, catching ships by the docks, or the merchants shipping their products around the empire. And I'm convinced they would think, it would not go well for you if you missed your boat or the caravan of goods. The Ephesians knew that they needed to be aware of time and to make the most of it every day. And the Apostle Paul is saying the same is true about what it means to follow Jesus. Be careful then how you live, not as unwise people, but as wise. To be wise is to number our days, to count our steps, and to consider how we live, consider our ways. The only alternative to that is we waste the time we have left. And time is a precious commodity. You can't buy more of it. So I think this brings us to our next reflection question. As we enter 2022, how can you avoid letting time pass you by? What do you need to start doing today? What do you need to stop doing today? Now, the interesting thing about taking time to ask these kind of questions about our lives is that our answers really reveal a lot about what we value. I remember I've done this sort of talk with youth groups before. Like when I was a youth pastor, I thought every kid was going to respond with, yes, I know what I want to do with my time. I want to follow Jesus. I want to live fully for him. I'm going to go to the mission field. I'm going to feed the poor, help the sick. I'm going to get involved in my church all the days of my life. But of course, as a youth pastor, I discovered the response is sometimes quite different. I remember this one kid named Patrick. We watched the same video that you and I watched, the Time You Have Left video with the JellyBeans. And he stone cold looked me in the face and said, right then, this is exactly why I need to stop listening to my mom. She's always making me clean my room, study for school, and visit with my relatives. I would rather spend my time with my mates at a party. For Patrick, his biggest value in life was having a good time with his friends. And your values will always shape the direction of your life, the decisions you make. And the thing about values, and you should remember this, not every value you have is a good one. For Patrick, at that point in his life at least, he valued his friends above all else, even his family. And I remember I responded to Patrick and I said something like this. I said, friends are great, but they don't always last forever. Some of the best friends that I had in high school are not in my life today. People move away, people grow apart, and some friendships don't last forever. And I think that's why when we talk about living wisely with the time we have left, we need to consider what really matters. And are the things we value going to hold their value forever? Are we actually investing our time into things that are going to bring us a good return? I think Jesus summarizes those sorts of considerations when he teaches on the Sermon on the Mount. He says in chapter 6 of the Gospel according to Matthew, he says, "Do not lay up for yourselves treasure on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourself treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Here, Jesus is teaching us to invest in things of true value. There are two types of things we can invest in: treasures on earth or treasures in heaven. Earthly treasures, Jesus tells us, well, they don't last. Moth, rust, they destroy. Thieves break in and steal, like the thieves that broke into my garage and stole my bike this year. Heavenly treasures, though, they last. You'll always have them with you. It's the most secure investment you can make. And I think the key to understanding this passage is really knowing what Jesus means by treasure in heaven. What Jesus is not saying is, hey, don't worry about this life. Just wait for the next. Actually, what Jesus, when he's talking about heaven, he isn't referencing a location you go to when you die. Jesus is speaking about the realm and the dimension of God's activity. Jesus is speaking about the inbreaking kingdom ethics that he calls his disciples to follow. And when Jesus calls us to store up these kind of treasures in heaven, he's actually calling us to follow him in everything we do. He's saying that when you live the way I call you to, it will be lasting. It will be life-giving. It won't be for naught. And I think this is why you see Jesus followers often giving up their time, that precious commodity. And I think the actual truth is that some of our time commitments will only make sense in light of storing up treasures in heaven. They only make sense because we've learned to pattern our lives after Jesus, which is in the service of others. So I think of the folks in our church that give countless hours of their lives to serve others. The folks at Common Cupboards. The folks who hold babies week in and week out. The folks who take time to teach our kids about the Bible. or the people that I know grieve with others through our Grief Share program, or the folks who turn on sound systems and serve in our worship teams, or the story I heard of the house church or the home church that decided to gather food for a neighbor who lost his job at Christmas time. Those kind of reordering of their lives, of giving themselves up, are powerful indicators of what they value. And so let's go to our next reflection question. As you consider how you want to spend your time in 2022, what does it show you about what you value?
Thanks for joining us online today. I hope that you've been able to experience the love of Jesus through the worship and teaching this morning, and that you've been left with a lot to think about. Before we sign off, I just want to pray. Dear Lord, we thank you that we are still able to meet online, that you still bind this community together, even though we are spread out across the city and beyond. We pray that you continue to watch over us, that you would keep us safe and healthy, that you would make us your hands and feet, that where there is need, that we would respond, where we can support each other, that we would be able to do that. Give us your eyes, give us your hearts. Bless us this day. Thanks. We'll see you again next week.